The night begins softly, beneath the low hum of torches that flicker against the stone walls of a Macedonian palace. Outside, the air is cool and damp from the mountain winds that sweep down into Pella, carrying the scent of pine and the murmur of distant horses in their stables. Inside, the hall is alive with a quiet rhythm, the rustle of linen, the muted shuffle of servants moving between shadows, and the faint notes of a lyre echoing through the corridors like a lullaby. It is a night long ago, in the year 356 before the Common Era, and yet, if you close your eyes, you might feel it still, the glow of firelight, the breath of ancient ambition forming in the heart of a boy who would one day eat the world. At the center of this gentle storm of destiny sits young Alexander. The wooden table before him is simple, worn smooth by years of feasts and quarrels, of royal plans and soldiers' boasts. Tonight, it bears bowls of roasted lamb glistening with fat, bread still warm from the oven, and amphorae of wine that smell faintly of honey. Yet, while courtiers and captains reach eagerly for their share, the boy's plate remains half empty. His mother, Queen Olympias, watches from her side, her serpent-shaped bracelets gleaming in the torchlight. Across from her sits King Philip II, broad-shouldered, his beard streaked with the dust of battle and the pride of conquest. Between them, caught between power and expectation, sits the boy who refuses to eat. "I eat to train for war, not for pleasure," Alexander says quietly, pushing a piece of meat aside. His voice carries with a strange calm, the kind that turns heads even in a room filled with older men. A hush falls over the table. His father, known across Greece for his iron temper, lets out a low laugh that echoes like a drumbeat against the walls. "War," Philip mutters, reaching for his cup, "is not fought on an empty stomach, my son." But the boy does not flinch. He meets his father's gaze, blue eyes steady, the torchlight dancing in them like sparks on steel. Olympias smiles faintly, recognizing in her son the same fire that once made her defy kings. It is a small moment, just a refusal of a meal, but within it lies the seed of everything to come. Around this table, Alexander learns the lessons that will shape empires. From his father, the language of conquest; from his mother, the whispers of gods and destiny. Philip teaches him that the world bends to those who strike hard and fast, while Olympias tells him of Zeus, of divine blood and chosen sons. Between their two worlds, the brutal and the mystical, Alexander begins to shape his own, a vision not merely of victory, but of greatness itself. The air in the hall thickens with the mingling scents of lamb, olives, and burning pine resin. Servants move silently, refilling cups, tending to the fire. Outside, thunder rolls faintly over the mountains, a distant warning of the storms that lie ahead. The young prince listens to his father speak of politics and siege engines, of new alliances with Thessaly and the intrigues of Athens. Yet his mind drifts elsewhere, to the maps that hang in the study, to the lands his tutors describe in hushed wonder. Persia. India. The edges of the known world. Names that shimmer like stars beyond the horizon. He imagines riding across deserts, the sun burning gold on his armor. He imagines cities bowing before him, their languages strange but their awe universal. But for now, he sits quietly, tracing patterns in the grain of the wooden table, the world still far away, folded within his dreams. His tutor, Leonidas, a stern man charged with teaching him discipline, once told him that simplicity breeds strength. "Luxury softens the will," Leonidas had said, handing the boy coarse bread instead of honey cakes. A soldier must hunger for something greater than comfort. Alexander had taken those words to heart. Even now, while others feast, he measures every bite as though training his body to match the precision of his mind. Food, to him, is not indulgence, it is control. In this, he finds purpose, even peace. Olympias watches him closely, her expression unreadable. She has seen omens, serpents curling beside her bed, dreams filled with thunder and eagles. She believes her son is no ordinary child, that his spirit is touched by gods. In the flicker of the torchlight, her gaze softens with pride, but also a quiet sadness. For she knows that greatness is never gentle, it devours the soul as surely as war devours the world. Philip, meanwhile, speaks of campaigns and kingship, his deep voice filling the hall. He raises his cup and calls for toasts, to victory, to Macedonia, to the son who will one day surpass him. Around the table, soldiers shout their agreement, their laughter shaking the wooden beams. But young Alexander does not join in. He sits still, watching the flames curl around the logs, lost in a silence that seems to hum with thought. Even at 13, he feels the weight of destiny pressing softly against his shoulders. He knows, somehow, that he is meant to build something larger than his father's conquests, something eternal. Outside, the torches along the palace walls flicker in the wind. Beyond them, the fields lie in silver moonlight, stretching toward the mountains. Somewhere, a dog barks, and the sound fades into the stillness of night. The palace quiets as the feast draws to its end. Servants clear the table, the musicians' soft notes linger like ghosts. Olympias touches her son's shoulder as she passes, whispering, "The gods favor those who listen more than they speak." He nods, his thoughts already far beyond Pella. Later, when the torches burn low and the palace sleeps, Alexander stands alone by the window of his chamber. The stars are sharp and clear, scattered across the black Macedonian sky. He thinks of his father, his teachers, his mother's strange prophecies. He thinks of Achilles, his hero, the warrior who chose eternal glory over a long, quiet life. Somewhere deep within, he feels that same choice forming. He will not live an ordinary life, he will burn brightly, even if only for a moment in history's endless night. The air carries the faint scent of roasted lamb from the kitchens below, mingled with the cold breath of the hills. His stomach growls softly, but he ignores it. Hunger, to him, is not discomfort, it is a promise. A reminder of the empire he has yet to claim, of the world he has yet to consume. And so, beneath the dim stars of Pella, the boy who would one day be called Alexander the Great stands in silence, watching the horizon. The feast behind him fades into shadow. The torchlight dies down, leaving only the soft whisper of wind and the pulse of something far greater, an unspoken hunger, stretching out toward the edge of the world. Morning comes softly over the Macedonian countryside. The light is pale and golden, spilling over groves of olive trees and the tiled roofs of the small sanctuary at Mysa, where a group of boys, sons of nobles and princes, train their minds beneath the gaze of Aristotle. The air is crisp, filled with the scent of dew, earth, and the faint sweetness of figs ripening on the trees. The river nearby murmurs like a quiet teacher itself, a rhythm of patience and time. And there, seated on a low stone wall with a simple wooden bowl in hand, is Alexander, no longer a child, not yet a man, but already shaping himself into both student and conqueror. His breakfast is plain. A piece of coarse bread, a few olives, a handful of dried figs, and a cup of goat's milk warmed by the morning sun. Around him, the other boys eat the same meal, though some have added touches of indulgence, a drizzle of honey, a thicker slice of bread, an extra fig or two stolen from the kitchen. They laugh and tease one another, throwing olive pits into the grass. But Alexander sits apart, quiet, methodical. Every bite is measured. Every sip, deliberate. There is no hurry in his movements, only control. He learned this discipline not from the battlefield, but from the breakfast table. For here, in the small rituals of daily life, Aristotle teaches him lessons that will one day rule empires. The body, the philosopher says, his voice calm and clear, is the servant of the mind. A wise man does not obey his hunger, he commands it. The words sink deep. Alexander repeats them to himself as he chews the rough bread, feeling the strength of simplicity. He has seen men, mercenaries, courtiers, even kings, made weak by indulgence. His own father, Philip, with his feasts, his wine, his endless wars, burns through life like a torch too quickly lit. But Alexander dreams of endurance, of a fire that never fades. And so he trains himself, not only in arms and intellect, but in appetite. As the morning grows brighter, Aristotle's students gather beneath the shade of the cypress trees. The philosopher stands with a scroll in one hand and a sprig of thyme in the other, speaking not only of logic and ethics, but of moderation, the balance between pleasure and duty. Excess, he says, makes slaves of men. Restraint makes kings. The boys listen, though only some truly understand. For most, it is a lecture to endure before the midday games. For Alexander, it is revelation. Later that day, when the others sneak away to the kitchens and return with honey cakes, small golden pastries dripping with sweetness, Alexander declines. Come, one of his friends insists, laughing, you've studied enough philosophy for one morning. Even Aristotle eats. Alexander smiles faintly but shakes his head. If I cannot master myself, he says, how will I ever master the world? He says it without pride, without jest, simply as truth. The others exchange glances, half amused, half unsettled. They don't yet see the shape of the man forming beside them, the will sharpening like a blade, the patience deepening like a river in flood season. When the laughter fades and the sun rises higher, Alexander walks to the edge of the gardens. The air hums with bees, the scent of thyme thick in the heat. He looks out over the valley of Misa, the hills where shepherds guide their flocks, the olive groves shimmering silver green, the small white temple that marks the philosopher's school. It is a humble place, yet in this quiet corner of Macedonia, he feels something vast awakening within him. Aristotle joins him there, the older man silent for a while, letting the breeze carry their thoughts. Finally, he says, you seek greatness, Alexander. But greatness is not in victory. It is in control, of desire, of fear, of self. Alexander nods slowly. I know, teacher. But to rule the world, must one not hunger for it? Aristotle smiles. Yes. But hunger must serve the mind, not consume it. Eat when you must, desire when you must, but never let either master you. Those words linger, more nourishing than the bread or milk of the morning. Years later, Alexander will eat beneath Persian stars, surrounded by gold and conquered kings, yet still remember this valley, the smell of figs, the taste of salt on an olive, the steady calm of his teacher's voice. For now, as the other students drift into the shade, Alexander takes the last bite of his bread, wipes his hands, and drinks the final mouthful of milk. The bowl is empty, yet he feels full, of focus, of purpose, of something far stronger than food. Hunger, he realizes, is not his enemy. It is his teacher. And as the cicadas sing in the long grass and Aristotle's words fade into the hum of summer, the boy who will one day command armies closes his eyes and lets the stillness settle within him. Discipline has become his feast. Simplicity, his strength. The world will tempt him with honey and crowns, but he will always remember this taste, the clean, unadorned flavor of control. The sun is now high above the Macedonian hills, washing the grove of Misa in soft gold. Olive branches sway lazily in the warm breeze, scattering specks of light across the white marble benches where Aristotle's students gather for their midday meal. The scent of crushed thyme and baked bread drifts through the air, mingling with the distant hum of cicadas. Here, under the shade of tall cypresses, Alexander sits among his companions, Hephaestion, loyal and calm, Ptolemy, sharp-eyed and curious, and a handful of other noble sons whose laughter echoes between the trees. Between them lie simple dishes, figs sliced neatly on marble plates, clay bowls of olives and cheese, jugs of clear water drawn from the stream. There is nothing grand about the meal. Yet for these young men, this grove is a kingdom of its own, a place where ideas rule stronger than swords. Aristotle sits nearby, not as a distant philosopher but as a patient mentor, his scrolls unfurled beside him, the sunlight catching the fine edges of parchment. He does not lecture, he converses. Tell me, he says, his tone as calm as the wind through olive leaves, what does it mean to rule? Alexander pauses, olive between his fingers. He looks toward the horizon, where the faint blue mountains of Pella stand like watchful sentinels. To command, he answers after a moment. To have men obey your will. Aristotle smiles faintly. And what if your will is unworthy? What then, my prince? Hephaestion chuckles, tearing his bread. Then, teacher, it is best that the unworthy never learn to command. Laughter ripples through the circle, soft and youthful. But Alexander does not laugh. He is thinking, always thinking. Finally, he says, then to rule others, one must first rule oneself. Aristotle's eyes gleam, pleased. Precisely. That is the heart of kingship. The conversation drifts like the breeze, touching on virtue, courage, fate, and the nature of greatness. They speak of Achilles, Alexander's hero, who was both noble and doomed by pride. Aristotle reminds them that strength without wisdom destroys itself. Even Achilles, he says, needed a teacher. And even kings need restraint. Ptolemy, ever the skeptic, gestures with a smile. Restraint is fine for philosophers, but how does one conquer the world on bread and figs? The laughter this time is louder. Even Alexander allows himself to smile. Perhaps, he replies, the one who eats simply will march farther than those who feast too well. Aristotle nods approvingly. A strong body follows a strong spirit. Remember that when the world tempts you with ease. A breeze passes through the grove, lifting the edges of the scrolls. Sunlight spills across Alexander's hair, turning it to bronze. In that moment, he is not yet the conqueror of Asia or the legend who will carry Greek thought to India. He is just a boy in the company of friends, his laughter light, his future hidden behind the hum of summer. Hephaestion tosses a fig at him, grinning. Alexander catches it easily. You may rule the world one day, his friend teases, but you'll never escape me. Then you'll march beside me, Alexander replies, smiling in return. Someone must keep the king humble. Their laughter rings like music through the grove, mixing with birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The afternoon feels eternal, golden, weightless, peaceful. None of them can imagine how many of these faces will one day be gone, how the same hands that now share figs and bread will soon carry spears and banners across deserts. For now, the philosopher watches them with quiet pride. Enjoy this peace, Aristotle says softly. It is the root of wisdom. The world you seek to shape is built first within your mind. Alexander looks at him, thoughtful again. And what if the world resists being shaped? Then, Aristotle answers, you must shape yourself until the world follows. The meal ends slowly, with more conversation than food. The scrolls are rolled, the crumbs brushed away. The boys stretch in the shade, their laughter fading into content silence. The day will soon call them back to studies of logic, geometry, or strategy, but this moment, this simple lunch among olives and ideas, lingers like a memory of sunlight itself. Years later, when Alexander dines in Babylon surrounded by gold, wine, and conquered kings, he will remember this table, the marble plates gleaming with figs, the philosopher's calm voice, the joy of young minds in harmony with the world. He will remember that true greatness began not in conquest, but in conversation. Not in war, but in wisdom. And somewhere, in the whispering leaves of Mysa, the laughter of his youth still drifts like a forgotten prayer to simplicity. The torches burned high in the great hall of Pella, casting gold and shadow across the marble walls. The scent of roasted boar and honeyed wine filled the air, heavy and intoxicating. Musicians strummed their lyres in one corner, the rhythm drowned beneath the laughter of warriors and the shouts of Macedonian generals recounting their victories. This was King Philip II's table, a place of power, noise, and indulgence. Long wooden tables groaned beneath platters of meat, baskets of bread, and bronze cups spilling with red wine. Slaves moved like shadows between the guests, refilling goblets, clearing bones, offering figs, grapes, and roasted quail. At the head of the feast sat Philip, broad-shouldered, his good eye gleaming like a torch. He had conquered much of Greece by now, forging alliances with sword and gold alike. But tonight, he was not the general, he was the king among friends, flushed with wine and victory. Beside him sat Alexander, still in his teens, his posture straight even as the room tilted around him in chaos. He had eaten sparingly, a few pieces of bread, a handful of olives, while the others feasted. His eyes never stopped moving. He studied the generals, the flatterers, and most of all, his father. The music swelled, and Philip raised his goblet high. To Macedonia, he roared, sloshing wine onto the floor. And to the gods who favor the strong. The men cheered, banging their cups against the table. But Alexander did not raise his drink. He watched his father's face, the flushed skin, the careless grin. Strength, he thought, should never look so reckless. At the far end of the table, an old general leaned toward him, smiling through his beard. "Why so silent, young lion? The night is for laughter, not thought." Alexander gave a small, polite smile. "Even lions wait before they roar." The old man laughed and returned to his cup, thinking it a jest. But Aristotle's words echoed in Alexander's mind, "The man who conquers himself is greater than he who conquers cities." The feast dragged deep into the night. The floor was slick with spilled wine, the air thick with smoke and the sweet decay of too much pleasure. A fight broke out between two officers over a boast, and laughter turned to shouting, then to the dull thud of fists. Philip stood unsteadily, waving his arms. "Let them be," he slurred. "Better a bruised face than a coward's heart." Alexander rose too, his voice clear and cutting through the noise. "A bruised mind serves no king. They are drunk on your victories, father, not their own." The hall fell silent for a moment. Philip turned toward his son, his smile faltering. "You speak boldly for a boy," he said, his voice half amusement, half warning. "I speak only as you taught me," Alexander replied. "To see the world as it is, not as the wine makes it." A murmur passed among the guests. Philip's pride stung, his temper flaring like oil to flame. "Mind your tongue before it costs you your crown," he snapped. But Alexander did not flinch. His gaze stayed steady, unafraid. The crown should be earned by clarity, not clouded eyes. For a heartbeat, the hall froze. Then Philip laughed, a short, bitter sound, and turned back to his cup. The moment passed, but its shadow lingered. Later, when the torches burned low and the guests stumbled out, Alexander walked alone through the colonnade. The cool night air cut through the haze of wine and smoke. From the stables came the soft whicker of horses, from the courtyard, the faint rustle of the olive trees his mother had planted. He thought of his father, great conqueror, cunning diplomat, but a man undone each night by his own appetites. Alexander loved him fiercely, but feared what that love might make him become. He looked down at his hands, the hands that would one day hold empires. "I will not drown in my victories," he whispered to himself. "I will drink from the spring, not the cup." Inside the palace, the last of the candles sputtered out. The music was gone, the laughter faded. Only the echo of the feast remained, a clash of two men bound by blood and destiny, one ruled by indulgence, the other by discipline. It was at this table, more than any battlefield, that Alexander's war truly began, not against Persians or kings, but against the temptations of power itself. And in that quiet Macedonian night, with the smell of smoke still clinging to the stones, a prince learned the hardest truth of all, that every empire first begins with the conquest of one's own soul. The sun hung low over the plains of Asia Minor, a red coin dissolving into the dust of the horizon. The air shimmered with heat, thick with the scent of sweat, horsehide, and iron. Beneath this burning sky marched the army of Alexander of Macedon, a river of men and discipline stretching across the edge of the known world. They had left the green hills of Greece behind. Now there was only sand and stone, wind and silence, and the promise of conquest that kept them moving. When the sun fell and the campfires flickered to life, the army settled into its nightly rhythm. Shields stacked, spears grounded, boots unlaced. The men gathered in small circles, their laughter thin but sincere, their food plain but earned. There was no feast tonight, only barley cakes, dried figs, and the sharp taste of onions crushed between dusty fingers. Some men soaked their bread in water to soften it, others chewed slowly, staring into the embers as if the flames might speak. In the center of the camp, Alexander sat among his companions, not on a throne or in a tent of silk, but on the bare ground beside them. His cloak was dusty, his sandals worn. The gold and marble of Macedonia felt like another life, another world. His officers, men of noble birth, accustomed to better, looked uneasily at their rations. Parmenion, the seasoned general, broke the silence first. "My king," he said carefully, "our scouts passed a Persian convoy this morning, wine, honey, fine meats abandoned in their retreat. Perhaps it should be brought to your table." Alexander looked up from his simple meal, his expression calm but sharp. "My table," he said softly, "is the same as theirs." He gestured toward the soldiers, hunched in circles under the stars. "If they eat barley and dust, then so will I. I will not eat what my army cannot." Parmenion bowed his head, saying no more. But later that night, he found the Persian wine dumped into the sand, its sweetness lost to the desert. The Persians lived in splendor, their kings reclining on gold couches, feasting beneath canopies of silk. Their banquets were famous across Asia, roast lamb soaked in honey, spiced rice, figs drenched in syrup. Alexander's men knew this, and the temptation of victory's spoils tugged at them like a siren's song. Yet, each time such riches appeared, Alexander forbade indulgence. He remembered the words of his teacher, Aristotle, "The mind grows weak when the body grows soft." To him, hunger was strength, and discipline was destiny. One night, when the desert winds howled and water ran scarce, a group of scouts returned from the hills carrying a single helmet brimming with muddy water, the last they could find. They offered it to Alexander. He took it in silence. Every eye in the camp fixed on him. Then, without a word, he poured the water into the sand. The men gasped. "If my soldiers thirst," he said quietly, "then their king drinks nothing." That night, the army marched on without complaint. The gesture became legend, told and retold in whispers, like a holy act of leadership. Around the flickering tents, lantern light danced on faces hollowed by fatigue, but brightened by something else, loyalty. They were bound to their king not by fear, nor gold, but by the quiet understanding that he shared their hunger, their pain, their march through endless dust. When sleep finally came, it was deep and dreamless. The soldiers lay under the same stars that had watched Achilles and the heroes of old, their breaths rising in rhythm like one great living creature. Alexander sat awake a while longer, gazing toward the east. The wind carried the scent of faraway lands, Persia, Babylon, India, names that glowed like distant stars in his imagination. He reached into his satchel and took one last bite of barley bread, hard and dry, and smiled faintly. "This," he murmured to himself, "is what empires are built on, not feasts, but endurance." In the silence of the desert, his words faded into the wind, mingling with the murmurs of sleeping men. Tomorrow, they would rise again, lift their shields, and move forward, hungry but unbroken, chasing the horizon behind their tireless king. And so, beneath the vast indifferent sky of Asia, the warrior's table was set, not with silver or gold, but with loyalty, discipline, and the unyielding bond of shared hunger. The desert stretched endlessly, a golden graveyard beneath a pitiless sun. The year was 325 BCE, and Alexander's army, the conquerors of Persia, the heirs of empires, was dying of thirst in the Gedrosian desert. The wind blew in long, searing waves. The men's cloaks, once royal purple and scarlet, were faded and torn, stiff with salt from their sweat. Horses stumbled on cracked hooves. Camels groaned and collapsed, their bones whitening before dusk. The air itself shimmered like molten glass. The Great March, the return from India to Babylon, had become a trial of survival. They had crossed mountains, rivers, and kingdoms. But here, in the barren heart of Gedrosia, modern-day Baluchistan, no enemy could match the cruelty of nature. Even the strongest soldiers, Macedonians hardened by years of war, whispered prayers under their breath. Their tongues were swollen, lips split and bleeding. The leather water skins were long empty. Every breath was pain. That afternoon, the army halted among the dunes. The sun stood directly overhead, a burning eye. Men collapsed where they stood, faces buried in the sand. Amid this silence, a small group of scouts approached the king. Their shadows trembled as they knelt before him. One of them, a young soldier, no older than 20, held out a bronze helmet filled halfway with muddy water. His hands shook as he spoke. "Your Majesty," he rasped. "We found this, a little spring beyond the ridge. It's not much, but it's all that remains." The men nearby lifted their heads weakly, eyes hollow but hopeful. Even the horses turned toward the sound of the word water. Alexander looked at the helmet. The liquid inside was brown and warm, but to men on the edge of death, it was the purest treasure on earth. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he took the helmet into his hands. The soldiers watched in silence, a silence deeper than prayer. Some leaned forward, expecting him to drink. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight of their king's suffering. The desert wind hissed across the dunes. Alexander raised the helmet to his lips, and then, in one smooth motion, tipped it forward. The water spilled into the sand, vanishing instantly. A gasp rippled through the ranks, disbelief, sorrow, awe. Alexander's voice broke the stillness, calm and steady. "If I drink while my men thirst," he said, "then I am no king, only a man among beggars." He turned to the young soldier who had offered it, his eyes kind but fierce. "Better we thirst together than I drink alone." The boy bowed his head, tears mingling with dust. In that moment, something shifted across the camp, a current stronger than hunger, deeper than exhaustion. The men rose, their chests swelling with pride. They were starving, blistered, and broken, yet their spirits burned with renewed fire. No speech, no treasure, no victory had ever bound them so closely to their king. The gesture, that single act of self-denial, became legend before the sun even set. As night fell, the soldiers trudged onward under a sky thick with stars. The moonlight silvered the dunes, turning the desert into a ghostly ocean. The wind carried whispers of Alexander's name, not as that of a conqueror, but as something more sacred, a leader who shared their suffering. Later that night, when the campfires flickered weakly, men passed around empty flasks and laughed softly. "Did you see?" one murmured. "He poured it out, all of it." Another, his voice hoarse but proud, whispered, "If the king can endure, then so can we." Alexander sat apart, wrapped in his cloak, the stars reflected faintly in his tired eyes. His lips were cracked, his skin burned, but his resolve was unbroken. He thought of home, the cool rivers of Macedonia, the lush groves of Mysa, his youth spent under Aristotle's shade. How distant it all felt now. He touched the sand where the water had vanished and whispered softly, "To rule men, one must be worthy of their thirst." The desert answered only with silence, yet in that silence, his legend grew. By dawn, the army marched again. Weak, yes. Thirsting, yes. But no longer broken. Because they followed not a god, nor a tyrant, but a man who, in the moment of ultimate temptation, chose honor over survival. And in that choice, Alexander of Macedon became more than a conqueror. He became the embodiment of his own empire, enduring, proud, and unyielding beneath the same sun that tried to destroy him. The helmet of water became a story retold in every camp and city his army touched. It was not a tale of victory, but of virtue, proof that the greatest power lies not in what one takes, but in what one is willing to give up. As the sun rose once more over Gidrosia, the desert glowed with light, and the army, parched, weary, but undefeated, marched forward behind their king, each footstep whispering the same unspoken vow. If Alexander can endure, so can we. The torches burned low, their golden light trembling against the polished marble of Persepolis. Outside, the night was warm and heavy with the scent of roses. Within the grand hall, 1,000 candles shimmered against silver dishes, golden bowls, and jeweled goblets filled with dark wine. Music from Persian flutes drifted through the air, slow, haunting, and impossibly beautiful. It was 330 BCE, and Alexander the Great, conqueror of empires, stood at the threshold of another world, one he had claimed by fire and sword, but had yet to understand. He had entered Persepolis as a warrior, but now the city itself whispered to him as a tempter. For months, his army had marched through dust and hunger, across mountains and rivers, surviving on barley bread and discipline. But here, the tables stretched endlessly, groaning beneath mountains of spiced lamb, honeyed dates, figs dipped in rose syrup, roasted peacocks with jeweled feathers, and rice steamed with saffron and nuts. The Persians had mastered not only conquest, but pleasure. Alexander sat among nobles who once trembled at the name of Macedon. Now they knelt gracefully, their hands adorned with rings, their voices soft and persuasive. One nobleman, an old courtier in flowing white robes, bowed low before him and lifted a silver tray. On it lay a golden cup of honeyed wine, glinting like fire in the torchlight. "Drink, great king," he said in careful Greek. "Tonight, Persia offers you not battle, but peace. You are one of us now." Alexander's gaze lingered on the cup. The wine smelled of cinnamon and dates, sweet, intoxicating, dangerous. Around him, his generals had already begun to loosen their belts, to laugh, to taste, to forget the long road behind them. For the first time in years, Alexander saw his men content, their faces soft in the glow of victory. And for the first time, he felt something stir within him, the slow, luxurious pull of rest. He raised the cup, and the hall fell silent. The wine touched his lips. It was sweeter than anything he had ever known, warmth and perfume and gold. It tasted not of battle, but of surrender. And in that moment, he understood the true danger of empire. This was not a place of swords or rebellions. It was a place that conquered from within. The Persians did not need to fight him, they only needed to let him taste their world. Across the hall, Persian dancers moved like flame, their veils glinting with emeralds. The music throbbed softly, like a heartbeat. The air smelled of incense and rose oil, of luxury so deep it seemed divine. Alexander watched, silent and distant. His hand still held the cup, but his mind wandered. He remembered his father's drunken feasts, the roaring laughter, the arguments, the broken cups. He remembered Aristotle's voice under the olive trees, "Excess destroys kings faster than battle." He looked at his men, Ptolemy, eyes glassy with wine, Hephaestion, relaxed and smiling beside a Persian noblewoman, the hardened Macedonian generals feasting like the kings they had dethroned. He felt pride, and unease. Later that night, when the music softened and the torches dimmed, Alexander slipped away from the banquet. He walked barefoot across the marble floors, through open courtyards where fountains murmured and moonlight glowed on carved stone lions. The palace of Darius was magnificent, columns of gold, tapestries woven with silver thread, walls painted with stories of Persian kings who had ruled the world. And now, he, Alexander, ruled them all. He paused before a relief showing Cyrus the Great, seated upon a throne, surrounded by servants and jewels. The inscription below read, "The King who ruled in wisdom." Alexander touched the carving, his fingers tracing the ancient words. "And what will they carve for me?" he whispered. Would he be remembered as conqueror, or as a man conquered by his own success? Behind him, faint laughter floated from the banquet hall. He turned to see a flicker of firelight. And for an instant, it seemed to him that the flames were consuming the very walls, the city, the glory. He saw in his mind's eye the future, Persepolis burning, its splendor devoured by greed and wine. He bowed his head. The taste of the honeyed wine still lingered on his tongue, but it was no longer sweet. When he returned to his quarters, he ordered the torches extinguished and sat in the dark, the silence of Persia pressing around him. He thought of the deserts, the long marches, the shared hunger, the purity of those days before victory dulled the edge of purpose. And he knew, luxury was the final enemy. Outside, the wind rustled through the palm trees, carrying the scent of roses and ash. The empire slept, content and glittering. But in Alexander's heart, unease took root, the first small crack in the armor of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. As the last candle died, he whispered softly into the night, "I came to conquer the world, not to be conquered by it." And in that single vow, spoken to no one but the stars, the great king reminded himself, and all who would one day remember, that true power lies not in gold or glory, but in the will to resist them. The night began in music. Lutes and flutes trilled through the marble halls of Persepolis, mingling with laughter and the shimmer of gold cups. Torches flickered along carved pillars, their light glancing off jeweled crowns and polished armor. The scent of wine and burning incense drifted thickly through the air. It was a celebration, the greatest the world had ever seen. The conqueror of Asia, Alexander of Macedon, sat among his companions, crowned with ivy leaves, his cheeks flushed from endless toasts. The tables overflowed, spiced lamb dripping with honey, platters of roasted peacock, bowls of pomegranate wine, the air sweet and heavy. Musicians played while Persian dancers twirled, veils shimmering like liquid fire. Laughter echoed through the courtyards and down the steps of the royal palace of Darius, now Alexander's triumphal trophy. He had conquered the unconquerable. He had crossed deserts and mountains, crushed armies, taken empires. Now he sat on the throne of the great king, drunk on victory, and on the wine of Persia. Beside him reclined Hephaestion, his closest companion, his mirror in war and heart. His laughter rang bright, his eyes shining with admiration for the man who had reached the edge of the world. "Alexander," he said with a grin, raising his goblet, "tonight even the gods must envy you." Alexander's gaze drifted upward, toward the carved ceiling, painted with scenes of Cyrus and Darius, ancient Persian kings enthroned in their splendor. Their stone eyes seemed to watch him still, judging silently from the walls. He lifted his cup and drank deeply, trying to drown that gaze in the haze of wine. A courtesan, her hair braided with gold, leaned close and whispered, "Shall not the king of the world claim the palace as his own? Why leave it as the house of your enemies?" The music swelled. The air grew feverish. Someone, none would remember who, shouted above the din. "Burn it! Burn the palace of the tyrants! Let Persepolis fall as Persia fell!" The hall roared in agreement. Cups crashed to the floor. Wine spilled, dark as blood. Hephaestion stood, laughing wildly, holding a torch aloft. "For Greece," he cried, his voice drunk with pride. And then, Alexander rose. In that moment, half drunk, half divine, he seized the torch from his friend's hand. The crowd shouted his name, Alexander. Their voices a wave of chaos and devotion. He stepped into the courtyard, the torch blazing in the desert wind. Before him stood the palace of Xerxes, its columns glimmering under the moon. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. The fire hissed, eager. And then, with a single motion, he hurled the torch into the draperies. Flame met silk. The palace inhaled, and then exhaled in fire. The blaze leapt upward, red and gold, devouring everything, the tapestries, the thrones, the painted ceilings. It roared into the night sky like the wrath of forgotten gods. The music stopped, the dancers fled. Men cheered drunkenly, shouting, "For Greece! For the king," as the inferno spread. The sky glowed like dawn. Alexander laughed, his face lit by the reflection of the flames, his shadow dancing on the burning walls. But as the fire grew, so did the silence beneath it, the silence of realization. The roar became a whisper. The laughter faded. Hephaestion's torch fell from his hand. Alexander stood still, the heat blistering his skin, watching centuries of Persian glory turn to ash. In that red light, he saw not triumph, but desecration, not conquest, but madness. He turned away, but the light followed him, licking at his armor, glinting in his cup. The wine in his goblet trembled, glowing crimson, like blood or guilt. Later, when the flames had died and only smoke and ruin remained, he walked alone through the blackened halls. The marble cracked under his feet. Statues had melted into ghosts. He stopped before a charred throne, the seat of kings he had sworn to surpass, now nothing but ash. He sank to his knees. His voice was low, hoarse, almost childlike. "What have I done?" The silence offered no answer. Only the soft hiss of dying embers. When dawn came, the wind carried the smell of burnt cedar and sorrow across the ruined terraces. The palace still smoked, the sky pale and grey. Hephaestion found him seated among the ruins, his face streaked with soot and regret. "This was not victory," Alexander murmured. "This was vanity." Hephaestion said nothing. No one did. The soldiers who had cheered him the night before now avoided his eyes. For the first time since his youth, Alexander felt small. Not as a god or conqueror, but as a man who had lost control of himself. That night's fire would haunt him for years to come. The smell of smoke, the heat of wine, the reflection of flame in silver cups, they would linger like a curse. It was said that afterward, Alexander forbade music in his presence for many days. That he sat in silence, watching the ashes drift through the air like snow, and whispered again and again, "I burned a kingdom to prove I was king." The conqueror who had once ruled appetite had now been ruled by it. And from that night on, every victory tasted faintly of smoke. The air in India was unlike anything Alexander had ever known. Thick, fragrant, alive. The scent of jasmine, cardamom, mango, and wet earth mingled with the smoke of campfires along the banks of the Hydaspes River. Parrots screeched in the palms, and the warm rain fell like silk. It was 327 BCE, and the Macedonian army had reached the edge of the known world. Here, the land itself seemed to mock the idea of conquest. Rivers wider than seas, forests that swallowed armies whole, and a sun that burned without mercy. And yet, amid all this vastness, what struck Alexander most was the abundance, of life, of food, of color. He had crossed deserts where men drank mud and ate roots, but here, the markets overflowed with rice, bananas, coconuts, melons, and spices that smelled like heaven's own perfume. The first time he tasted Indian food, he paused, the flavor startled him. It was sweet, sharp, and burning all at once, a taste that seemed to wake the blood. One of his officers laughed. "My king, it's like eating fire." Alexander smiled faintly. Perhaps that is why the people here burned so brightly. In the evenings, the Macedonians feasted beneath open skies, the stars mirrored in copper bowls of spiced rice. The soldiers sang songs of home while the monsoon clouds rolled overhead. But even as his men embraced this new world, Alexander's mind turned toward something deeper. He had begun hearing of strange Indian philosophers, holy men who wore no gold, ate no meat, and slept upon the bare earth. They were called gymnosophists, naked thinkers. They lived outside the cities, untouched by wealth or war, their lives devoted to thought and silence. Intrigued, Alexander summoned one of them to his camp. The man came barefoot, skin darkened by the sun, his only garment a thin cloth around his waist. His eyes were calm, unafraid. He bowed neither to king nor crown. Alexander gestured toward the table set for him, platters of fruit, milk, bread, and spiced meats, all carefully prepared to honor the guest. "Eat," Alexander said kindly. "You are welcome among us. Let us share the table, as friends." The sage looked at the food, then at the king. "I thank you," he said softly, "but I do not eat when others hunger." Alexander frowned. "There is no hunger here tonight. My men are fed." "You honor me by joining this meal." The philosopher's gaze was steady. "A king who cannot fast," he said, "is a slave to his hunger. You have conquered nations, Alexander of Macedon. But tell me, have you conquered your own desires? The camp fell silent. The soldiers, who had been laughing moments before, lowered their eyes. Alexander's hand froze above his goblet. The word stung, not as insult, but as truth. He thought of the feasts of Persepolis, of the wine that burned like guilt, of the nights when victory had tasted too rich. The sage continued, his voice as calm as the river nearby. We who eat little need little. You who consume the world must carry it wherever you go. Alexander leaned back, studying him. And yet, you live in the dirt, he said gently. You own nothing. The sage smiled faintly. Then I am owned by nothing. Which of us is freer? A long silence followed. Only the sound of rain falling on the tents broke it. Then Alexander did something none expected, he stood and bowed. You are a greater king than I, he said quietly. You rule yourself. The philosopher inclined his head. Then learn to sit at your own table in peace. And with that, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness beyond the campfires. For a while, no one spoke. Then Hephaestion murmured, he insulted you, my king. Alexander shook his head. No, Hephaestion. He reminded me. That night, Alexander sat alone by the river. The rain had stopped, and the scent of mango blossoms filled the air. In his hand was a single bowl of rice. He ate slowly, tasting each grain, as though rediscovering what food was meant to be, not indulgence, but sustenance. He thought of the philosopher's words again. A king who cannot fast is a slave to his hunger. In that quiet, something inside him shifted. He had crossed half the world seeking glory, but here, in this strange, sacred land, he began to glimpse another kind of victory, one not carved in stone or blood, but in restraint. The next morning, when his officers gathered for breakfast, they found the royal table stripped of extravagance. Only fruit, rice, and water remained. Alexander smiled faintly at their surprise. We dine as kings of discipline, he said. For the man who rules his hunger rules his world. And as the sun rose over the Indian plains, gilding the river in gold, even the most hardened Macedonian felt something new, not hunger, not triumph, but peace. It was said that from that day onward, Alexander's meals became simpler, quieter, each one a reminder of that night by the river when the world's greatest conqueror learned the oldest truth of all. That the mightiest feast is not found on golden plates, but in the mastery of one's own desires. The long road home stretched endlessly across the baked earth, silent, shimmering, and heavy with the dust of 1,000 marching feet. The Indian rains were long behind them now, and the songs of tropical birds had faded into memory. What remained was fatigue, deep, bone-carved fatigue that even victory could not soothe. The army moved westward once more, toward Persia, toward Babylon, toward something like home, though none of them truly knew what that meant anymore. They had seen wonders, elephants thundering through battlefields, rivers wider than seas, mountains that kissed the clouds. They had crossed the edge of the world and survived. But now, even Alexander, who had once burned with the fire of gods, walked slower than before. In the evenings, when the sun melted behind the ridges and the campfires flickered weakly against the wind, the men gathered in small, quiet circles. No more songs of conquest. No more toasts to glory. Only soft murmurs, stories of home, of mothers, of vineyards, of peace. One night, as the wind hissed over the plain, Alexander sat among them, not on a throne, nor beside gold, but on the bare ground. A wooden bowl rested in his hands. In it lay lentils and coarse bread, nothing more. The same meal he had eaten as a boy in Mysa under Aristotle's olive trees. The men noticed and fell silent. He dipped the bread into the lentils and ate slowly, the taste humble but clean. Around him, the smell of smoke and earth hung thick in the air. The men watched, their king, who had dined in palaces, now sharing their simple supper. For a moment, no one spoke. The world seemed to pause. He looked up, his gaze soft. Do you remember, he said quietly, when we had nothing but hunger and purpose? A few men smiled faintly. Others looked into the fire, lost in thought. I used to think, Alexander continued, that greatness meant more lands, more gold, more victories. But tonight, this, he held up the small wooden bowl, feels greater than all of it. The soldiers listened. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between his words. Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Indians, and Scythians, the living mosaic of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Columns wrapped in silk rose high above them, and between them hung bronze lanterns flickering in the warm night air. Long tables stretched endlessly, covered in gold plates, wine cups shaped like lions, and platters stacked with roasted lamb, figs, almonds, and honey. The air was alive with music, the rhythm of drums and lutes blending with the murmur of 100 languages. And at the center of it all sat Alexander, radiant and weary, the king who had conquered the world, yet looked as though he carried it on his shoulders. He wore no armor that night, only a robe of deep purple, its hem embroidered with the symbols of Persia and Macedon intertwined, the emblem of his dream, one world, one people. As the feast began, trumpets sounded, and servants carried torches through the crowd. Then came a hush, that strange, reverent quiet that always followed his presence. Alexander rose, lifting his cup. Tonight, he said, voice strong but measured, we are not conquerors and conquered. We are one table, one family, bound by the blood we've shed and the bread we share. Applause rippled like a wave through the gathering. Then, in a gesture that stunned many, Alexander began to rearrange the seats. He ordered Macedonian soldiers, the rough men who had fought beside him since boyhood, to sit beside Persian nobles dressed in silks and jewels. He paired Greek generals with Egyptian priests, Indian envoys with Babylonian scribes. Some resisted, murmuring that such mixing was beneath them. But Alexander only smiled, his eyes steady. We have crossed deserts together, he said. We have bled together. Let us now learn to eat together. And so they did. For hours, laughter filled the air, cautious at first, then genuine. Wine flowed, dancers spun between tables, and musicians from every corner of the empire played in harmony. It was, for one night, a vision of the world as Alexander dreamed it, a vast, golden circle where differences dissolved under shared light. Yet even amid the music, a shadow lingered. Those who watched the king closely saw that he did not eat much. He lifted his cup often but rarely drank. His eyes, though bright, seemed far away, lost somewhere between triumph and fatigue. To his right sat Hephaestion's empty seat, draped with a cloak of blue and gold. His death months earlier had hollowed something inside Alexander that no empire could fill. As the dancers spun and laughter swelled, he stared at that seat in silence. For all the noise and splendor, he felt only the deep, echoing quiet of absence. At one point, a Persian noble raised a toast, to Alexander, the living god. The word struck him like a stone. Once, he might have smiled at such praise. But now, it sounded like mockery, a crown too heavy to bear. He rose slowly. The music faltered. The torches flickered in the hush. No. Man is a god, he said softly, almost to himself. We eat, we drink, we fall ill, and we die. Only our dreams live on. He lifted his cup toward the empty seat beside him, toward Hephaestion, toward youth, toward all that had already slipped beyond reach. Tonight, he said, we feast not for conquest, but for remembrance. The soldiers drank in silence. The Persians bowed their heads. The music resumed, but it felt different now, slower, gentler, mournful beneath its beauty. Somewhere in the distance, a night wind stirred the torches, and the flames bent toward the east, as if the world itself listened. Alexander sat back down, the crown upon his brow catching the light of the dying fire. Around him, the empire he had built celebrated, unaware that its master was fading. For the first time, the feast that was meant to unite the world felt strangely hollow, a brilliant echo of something already passing. As the night drew on, and the dancers grew weary, Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. The music became distant, the voices blurred, and in his mind, he saw again the wooden table of his childhood, the humble bowl of lentils, the laughter of simpler days. He smiled faintly, and whispered under his breath, "Perhaps greatness is nothing more than the memory of hunger." When dawn came, the feast was over. The fires burned low, the guests drifted away, and Babylon sank into silence. But for those who had been there that night, one image endured, the sight of a tired king at a golden table, smiling softly at ghosts, while the empire celebrated its own illusion of eternity. And so the victory banquet, meant to proclaim the height of Alexander's glory, became instead a quiet prelude to his decline, a grand, glittering theater of power, haunted by the truth that even the mightiest must one day hunger again. The palace of Babylon had fallen quiet. The torches burned low, their smoke curling like soft gray ribbons in the dawn air. Outside, the city still slept, but within the great marble chamber of the king, a single candle flickered beside a bed where the most powerful man on earth lay still, breath shallow, eyes distant. It was June, 323 BCE. Alexander of Macedon, conqueror of the known world, was dying. For days, his generals and physicians had come and gone in silence, carrying bowls of broth, trays of fruit, and flagons of wine, all left untouched. The man who once shared the hard bread of soldiers, who had feasted with kings and philosophers, could now barely lift a cup of water to his lips. The one who had conquered hunger itself, who had poured a helmet of water into the sand to prove his strength, was now conquered by frailty, betrayed by the very body that had carried him across continents. The room was filled with the scent of cedar oil and faint traces of incense, burned to ease his pain. In the stillness, the faint hum of cicadas drifted in from the gardens. Beyond the window, the river Euphrates gleamed under a pale sun, the same river where his fleet once prepared to sail eastward, chasing dreams no man could catch. Alexander stirred. His eyes, clouded yet bright, moved slowly toward the empty table beside his bed, a tray of figs, a loaf of bread, and a small clay cup of watered wine. He smiled faintly. It seemed almost cruel, the irony, a table fit for a king, and yet he could not eat from it. His hand trembled as he reached for a fig but stopped halfway. Instead, his gaze drifted inward, far beyond the chamber, across time itself, back to where it all began. He saw himself as a boy, sitting at the long wooden table in Pella, refusing the honeyed meats served by his father's court. He could almost hear his mother, Olympias, scolding him gently, "A king must eat like a king." And his small, proud voice replying, "I eat to train for war, not for pleasure." A faint laugh escaped his lips, dry and weak, but real. Even now, that same stubborn pride pulsed faintly in his chest. The vision shifted. He saw himself beneath the olive trees of Mysa, breaking bread with Aristotle, sunlight glinting off scrolls spread across the table. The philosopher's voice echoed softly. To rule others, one must first rule oneself. He remembered nodding solemnly, not realizing then how heavy those words would become. Next came another memory, the helmet of water in the desert, his men watching as he poured it into the sand. Their faces, hollow, sunburnt, loyal, all staring in disbelief. What they did not know was how much that moment had cost him. How fierce his thirst had been. How deeply he had understood that a leader's hunger must be shared. Then, darker memories followed, the Persian banquets. The silver platters, the gold cups overflowing with spiced wine. The laughter, the dancers, the music thick with temptation. He had told himself it was diplomacy. Unity through celebration. But somewhere between the wine and the fire, he had crossed a line. From mastery to indulgence, from discipline to desire. He remembered the night Persepolis burned, the flames licking the sky, his soldiers drunk on victory and wine. He had watched the palace crumble, torchlight flickering across his face, and in that glow, he had seen not triumph, but guilt. The guilt of a man who had feasted too long on power. The memories came faster now, as though his mind were feeding on the fragments of a fading life. He saw India, the rich sense of spice and fruit, the philosophers who refused his invitation to dine. He saw one old sage smile and say, "A king who cannot fast is a slave to his hunger." At the time, Alexander had laughed. Now, lying weak and breathless, he understood. He opened his eyes again. The candle beside him flickered, and the shadows seemed to dance like memories upon the walls. Somewhere, faintly, he could hear music, the plucking of a lyre, perhaps from the courtyard below. It reminded him of home. Of the nights before war, before empire, before exhaustion. He thought of Hephaestion, his brother in arms, his closest soul. They had once eaten together every day, dividing a single loaf between them, laughing in the desert wind. Now, Hephaestion's place was empty, and Alexander's appetite, for food, for conquest, for life itself, had vanished with him. He felt the warmth draining from his hands. The candlelight swam, and his chest rose slowly, like the tide before stillness. A priest approached, holding a bowl of water infused with herbs. "Sire," he whispered, "to ease your pain." Alexander smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Give it to the men. They have farther to go than I." The words hung in the air, gentle, final, familiar. Outside, the sun broke over Babylon, washing the river in gold. The conqueror lay silent now, eyes open toward the light. On the table beside him, the bread remained untouched. The figs dried slowly in the warmth. The cup of wine glimmered, still, eternal. And in that stillness, his life's meaning gathered into a single truth. Food had always been his mirror, of discipline, ambition, temptation, and loss. He had begun with simplicity, fed his dreams with hunger, and ended by learning that the greatest strength was not conquest, but restraint. As his breath faded, it seemed as if he was no longer in Babylon but standing once more beside the Nile-blue waters of youth, breaking bread with Aristotle, smiling at lessons that had taken a lifetime to understand. The candle's flame trembled and went out. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the city beyond. And in that silence, the story of Alexander the Great came to rest, not with the clash of swords or the roar of armies, but with the whisper of a man who once ruled the world learning to let go. He conquered empires, cities, and kings. But the final truth was this. He could never conquer hunger, not the hunger for life, nor for meaning, nor for peace. And yet, even now, his table remains, set with lessons for all who would rule their own desires. That power fades, feasts end, and glory turns to dust. But the discipline to share, to endure, and to rise above desire. That, perhaps, is the only empire that never dies.